Every July, in the far north of Japan, on a peninsula that juts into the cold northern sea, a woman in white is led by the hand along a narrow gravel path. She is old. Most of the people who do this work now are old. She is also blind. She has been blind since she was a child. The wind here smells of sulfur. It has always smelled of sulfur. It rises from vents in the volcanic earth, hissing softly through cracks in the ground, and it carries, at the edge of hearing, a sound that visitors never quite agree on. Some say it sounds like murmuring. Others say it sounds like nothing at all. The woman is led to a small tent or to a wooden hut at the edge of a temple courtyard, and she sits down. She arranges a rosary of stones and bones in her lap. She waits. Outside, a line begins to form. There are widows in the line. There are mothers. There are men in their 60s who lost a brother half a century ago and have never stopped wanting to say one more thing to him. Some of them have come from nearby villages. Some have taken the train from Tokyo, 8 hours north, then a bus, then another bus, then the slow final road up to the caldera. They have all come to ask this blind woman to do something that, in most of the modern world, we agreed to stop believing in a long time ago. They have come to ask her to let them speak to the dead, and she will. This place is called Osorezan. The name, in Japanese, means mountain of fear or mountain of dread. For more than 1,000 years, in Japanese folk belief, this has been understood as one of the places where the world of the living thins, and where the world of the dead, whatever that means, presses against the surface and sometimes answers back. The woman is called an Itako. There used to be many of them. They were trained from the age of 12 or 13, almost always blind girls from poor families in this cold northern region, and they spent years learning by heart the chants and rituals that would allow them eventually to carry the voice of a dead person in their own mouth. The ritual was called kuchi-ose, the calling down of the dead. Today, by most counts, there are 4 or 5 Itako left. Their average age is well over 80. The youngest of them became an Itako in a world that no longer exists. This is the story of the mountain. It is also the story of the women who, for 1,000 years, stood at its edge and listened for things most people could not hear. And it is, increasingly, the story of what happens to a culture when the last person who knows how to perform a particular kind of listening finally closes her eyes for the last time. Because that silence is coming, it may already have begun. To get to Osorezan, you travel. That is part of what the place is. The mountain sits on the Shimokita Peninsula, in the far north of Aomori Prefecture, which is itself the northernmost prefecture of Japan's main island of Honshu. Shimokita is shaped on a map, something like an axe. Osorezan is near the blunt edge of the blade. North of it there is only the cold Tsugaru Strait, and beyond that, the island of Hokkaido. For most of Japanese history, this was the edge of the known world, a place where the empire's writ grew thin, a place where people went when they had nowhere else to go. The wider region is called Tohoku. It is, geographically, only a few hundred kilometers from Tokyo. Culturally and historically, it has often felt much further. Tohoku is a land of long winters, deep snow, short growing seasons, and for much of its past, recurrent famine. The great famines of the Tenmei era in the late 18th century and the Tenpo era in the mid-19th killed hundreds of thousands of people in these northern provinces, some through starvation, some through the diseases that followed. Entire villages were reported to have died. In older times, families with no way to feed all their children sometimes practiced a form of infant exposure known as ma-biki, a word that literally means thinning, in the sense of thinning out seedlings in a field. Tohoku remembered its dead differently than the warmer south, because Tohoku had seen so many of them, and so many of them small. The Japanese pilgrims who have come here for centuries understood, in a way that modern travel has mostly erased, that the effort of the journey was not incidental to the experience. It was the experience. The distance was a kind of preparation. You did not come to Osorezan easily, because the things you came for were not easy. When you reach the town at the base of the mountain, a place called Mutsu, you can still board a local bus that climbs up into the caldera. The road is quiet. You pass through cedar forest, then thinner forest, then suddenly no forest at all. The trees stop. The ground changes color, pale yellow, streaked with white and black. The air changes too. You start to smell the sulfur before you see the lake. By the time the bus lets you off, at the edge of a gravel parking lot in front of a small temple, you are no longer entirely in the world you started from. This is a place that was always meant to feel this way. Osorezan is, in strict geological terms, an active volcano. The last major eruption was more than 10,000 years ago, which left behind the shape that still defines the place. A wide caldera, a ring of low peaks, and at the center, a pale green lake. The lake is called Usori. Its color is the color of things that have been touched by sulfur for a very long time. The caldera floor is not a pleasant place to walk. In some ways, it is barely a place at all. The ground is loose volcanic gravel and rock, so pale it looks bleached. Almost nothing grows on it. Vents in the earth release steam and gases that smell sharply of sulfur and something stranger underneath. The rocks around these vents are stained orange and yellow, and in places a soft, sickly green. Hot springs bubble up out of the ground, too hot to touch. The lake's water is acidic enough that it cannot support most aquatic life, a consequence of the volcanic minerals that have leached into it for thousands of years. Then you begin to notice the piles of stones. They are everywhere across the caldera floor. Small cairns, sometimes a few stones high, sometimes higher. Most of them are the work of visitors, stacked one by hand. In Japanese folk Buddhism, there is a belief about children who die before their parents. They are said to be unable to pass easily into the next life, because by dying first, they have caused their parents grief. They are imagined as gathered on the banks of a dry riverbed, in a borderland called Sino Kawara, where they must build small towers of stones as an offering of merit, so that eventually they can cross. Each night, demons come and knock the towers down. The children begin again in the morning. A bodhisattva called Jizo, the small stone figure often seen in Japanese graveyards, watches over them and protects them as he can. The caldera floor at Osorezan is understood by long tradition to be that riverbed. When you see a visitor quietly stacking stones on the caldera floor, they are almost always doing it for a child, for one they lost, for one their mother lost, for one whose name they may no longer even know. And then there are the pinwheels. Along the paths and around the cairns, and tucked against the rocks, there are brightly colored pinwheels, mostly red, mostly plastic, thousands of them. They spin when the wind comes across the caldera, which it almost always does. The pinwheels are offerings. They are for the children, left so that the children in the other world will have something to play with. Visitors bring them from home. Some bring toys, small shoes, candy. The wind picks it all up, moves through it, keeps the wheels turning. If you stand still in the caldera long enough, the combined sound of all those small plastic blades in the wind becomes one sound. It is the first thing most visitors remember afterward. A wooden footpath circles part of the caldera. It passes between the fumaroles, past stone Jizo figures weathered smooth by rain and gas, down to the shore of Usori Lake itself, whose water is cold and acidic and will not sustain most fish, with the exception of a single species of freshwater fish that has somehow, over thousands of years, learned to live in it. At the lake's edge, visitors often pause. The water is quiet. Across it, the low peaks of the caldera rim hold the sky in a wide, pale circle. People have written that it is the most peaceful place they have ever stood in, and also the most unsettling, and they do not see a contradiction. This is what the dead look like, in this particular Japanese imagination. Not ghosts, not voices yet, just wheels turning in a sulfur-smelling wind on ground that nothing will ever quite grow on. At the edge of the caldera, where the footpath begins, stands a small temple complex called Bodhiji. According to tradition, the temple was founded in the year 862 by a Japanese Buddhist monk named Ennin, also known by his posthumous title Jikaku Daishi. Ennin had spent nearly a decade in Tang Dynasty China, studying esoteric Buddhism and bringing its texts back to Japan. The story is that while he was in China, he had a dream of a mountain in the far north of his own country. A mountain with a pale caldera lake at its heart. A voice in the dream told him that this was a place where the boundary between the worlds was thin, and that he should find it and build there. When he returned to Japan, he went looking. Eventually, the story says, he found Osorezan. Whether this account is historically accurate is less important than the fact that it is the account the place has been telling about itself for more than 1,000 years. For those 1,000 years, Osorezan has held a specific role in the Japanese spiritual imagination. It is sometimes listed as one of the 3 great sacred mountains of Japan, alongside Mount Koya in the south and Mount Hiei near Kyoto. But while those two are centers of formal Buddhist doctrine and scholarship, Osorezan has always been something else. It is the place where Buddhism and something older, something closer to the folk religion of the region, meet and do not quite separate again. The temple's formal affiliation is with the Soto school of Zen Buddhism. It is administered by a mother temple, Ensuji, in the town of Mutsu below. Monks conduct services in the traditional way. Visitors can stay overnight in the temple lodging and bathe in its hot springs, which are piped directly from the volcanic ground and are, by most accounts, some of the most unusual bathing water in Japan. But the real reason most people come is not the formal religion. They come because at the edge of this temple, during the twice-yearly festival called Osorezan Taisi, held for a few days every July and again in October, the Itako set up their small tents and their folding stools, and they agree, for as long as the festival lasts, to do the oldest work the mountain is known for. The temple does not officially sanction this. The Itako are not Buddhist clergy. They have no formal relationship with Bodhiji. They are simply present, and the temple, for 1,000 years or something close to it, has agreed not to turn them away. That accommodation is part of what Osorezan is. The formal and the folk, the doctrine and the grief, the monk and the blind medium, all operating on the same small piece of ground, without needing to resolve what any of them thinks of the others. In much of the modern world, organized religion has separated itself carefully from the older, quieter practices. At Osorezan, the two still coexist without resolving messier practices that preceded it. At Osorezan, that separation has never fully taken. It may be one of the last places in Japan, and one of the last in the world, where it has not. An Itako, in the old understanding of the word, is a blind woman who has been trained to carry the voice of a dead person in her own mouth. The practice is very old. It belongs to a layer of Japanese religion that predates the arrival of Buddhism, a form of folk shamanism in which certain people, through long ascetic training, become able to communicate with the spirits of the dead, with local gods, and with the unseen forces of the land. In other parts of Japan, similar figures have existed under different names. In Tohoku, they were called Itako, and in Tohoku, they were almost always blind. This was not incidental. In the cold northern villages of 19th and early 20th century Japan, a blind daughter was, in a strict economic sense, a problem. She could not farm easily. She could not weave reliably. In a society built around physical labor and seasonal survival, families worried about how such a child would feed herself as an adult. A small number of professions were open to her. For blind men, the most common was performing classical music, or a form of specialized massage. For blind women in the north, the most respected option was to become an Itako. The training began young, usually around the age of 12 or 13. A girl would be apprenticed to an older Itako, who would teach her almost entirely by voice and by repetition the long chants and sutras and lists of local deities she would need to know. The core of the training was memorization, performed without written texts, which the students could not have read in any case. A trainee had to hold hundreds of chants in her head, along with the correct sequence of prayers for a funeral, a memorial, a spirit calling, an illness, a new baby. The teacher recited, the student repeated, again and again and again, for years. The final ordeal in traditional practice was an initiation ritual that varied slightly by teacher, but generally involved some version of the same test. The trainee was made to fast for many weeks, in some accounts for months. She was doused with freezing water from the local river or shrine, sometimes dozens of times a day through the depths of winter. She chanted continuously, often in a small dark room, with almost no sleep, often in the cold. At the end of this, if she had not collapsed and had not been sent home, she was brought before her teacher and a group of witnesses for the final rite. In that rite, traditionally, she was said to enter a state of possession. A spirit or a god was understood to descend and to take her as its vessel. If the descent happened, the girl was now an Itako. She was given a small set of ritual objects, including a rosary of stones and animal bones, an old coral called an Irataka Juzu, and a new identity. She was not a priestess in any institutional sense. She belonged to no church. She was a woman who could, the tradition said, hear. For the rest of her life, she would make her living traveling from village to village, performing rites for families, blessing newborns, chanting for the sick, and most famously of all, calling down the dead for those who wished to speak with them. At Osorezan, twice a year, many of them would gather. It was, in a quiet way, the closest thing they ever had to a professional convention. Families who had lost someone that year, or long ago, would travel to the mountain, knowing that the Itako would be there. They would wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for an entire day, for their turn, and then, one by one, they would step inside the small tent and hand to a blind old woman in white the name of someone they could no longer reach any other way. The ceremony of calling down a dead person is called kuchiyose. The word means, roughly, bringing the voice near. It unfolds in its traditional form, something like this. A visitor enters the small tent or wooden hut and sits down on a cushion across from the Itako. They tell her the name of the person they wish to speak to. They tell her the family relationship. They tell her the year of death. They tell her sometimes the cause. They do not have to say much more than that, although some visitors do. The Itako listens. She closes her eyes, if they are not already closed. She takes her Irataka Juzu, the rosary of bones and stones and coral, and she begins to move it through her fingers. She begins to chant. The chant itself, to most visitors, is not entirely intelligible. It is a dense, fast, rhythmic flow of syllables, drawing on old Buddhist invocations, on lists of local deities and mountain spirits, on archaic forms of the Tohoku dialect. It goes on for several minutes. The Itako's body rocks slightly. Her breathing changes. The chant accelerates, then slows, then shifts. Then her voice changes. What comes out of her mouth next is understood by the visitor and by the Itako herself to no longer be her own voice. It is the voice of the dead person. It may speak in a slightly different register, a different rhythm, a different accent. Sometimes it is gentle, sometimes it is brief. It may address the visitor by a name that only the dead person would have used. It may reference something small and specific, a favorite food, a room in a house, a promise the visitor had forgotten, or had not forgotten, but had never told anyone. The message is almost never long. 5 sentences, 10, sometimes only 1. Often what the dead person says, through the Itako's mouth, is some version of the same small handful of things. I am at peace. I am not angry. I am not cold. Take care of your mother. Take care of yourself. Do not cry so often. Skeptics have written for as long as there have been Itako about how such messages could be produced through skill, suggestion, cold reading, and the intense need of the listener to hear exactly those words. Many of those critiques are reasonable. Some of them are certainly correct. None of them have ever meaningfully reduced the number of people willing to travel to a cold mountain in Tohoku, sit on a cushion, and take whatever they are given. In accounts collected by Japanese folklorists over the 20th century, the same detail appears again and again. Visitors describe stepping out of the tent afterward, walking back out onto the caldera path, and feeling, for the first time in months or years, something loosen in them. Not closure exactly. They know in most cases that the voice they heard may have come from an old woman's performed trance. That knowledge does not seem to make the effect go away. Grief, it turns out, is a relationship. When a person dies, that relationship does not end. It simply has no one to talk to. The Itako, for those few minutes, provides a second chair. The chair may be theatrical. It may be a beautiful illusion. For the person who came to sit in front of it, that has often been enough. The Itako themselves have rarely made much money from this. A small fee per session, set lower than many people would guess. A folding stool, a small tent, a rosary, a voice. That has been the shape of the practice, at Osorezan and across Tohoku, for a very long time. It is not the shape it will have for very much longer. In the middle of the 20th century, there were still hundreds of active Itako in Tohoku. The exact number is hard to establish. The practice was never licensed, never formally counted, and never fully recognized by the Japanese state as a profession. What is clear is that in the decades immediately after the Second World War, the demand for what the Itako did was as high as it had ever been. The Pacific War, which ended in August of 1945, had killed somewhere in the range of 3 million Japanese, most of them young men, most of them dying far from home, in the Pacific Islands, in China, in Southeast Asia, and at sea. The families who survived them almost never received a body. In many cases, they received nothing at all, but a small wooden tablet with a name written on it, and sometimes not even that. In the vacuum that followed, a ritual that allowed a mother to feel that she had, finally, heard from her missing son became, for a decade or more, a kind of lifeline. Through the late 40s, the 50s, and into the 60s, the path up to Osorezan was often crowded. Photographs from the period show long lines outside the Itako tents. Some of the visitors had been waiting since before dawn. Some had walked for days. Then slowly, the tradition began to end. The reasons are practical, and they say more about modern Japan than they do about Osorezan. In 1947, in the wake of the war, the Japanese government passed a new law regulating the professions of massage, acupuncture, and related manual therapies. For the first time, these became formally certified occupations, with training programs explicitly designed to be accessible to blind students. Over the following decades, the traditional pathway that had channeled many girls into Itako training was no longer the only path, and then, gradually, no longer the primary one. Blind women in Japan now had other options. Certified massage therapy paid steadily. It did not involve weeks or months of fasting. It did not require learning hundreds of sutras by heart. It did not require walking from village to village through the snow, carrying all your instruments in a small cloth bag. At the same time, the old teachers were dying. The senior Itako who had trained in the early 20th century, who held the full weight of the tradition in their memories, began to reach the end of their lives through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Each one who died took a body of knowledge that had never been written down anywhere else. The younger Itako they had trained were fewer. The Itako those younger women trained, fewer still. By the year 2000, most estimates placed the total number of active Itako in Tohoku at around 20. By 2010, perhaps a dozen. By the early 2020s, all of them are elderly. Nakamura Take, Matsuda Hiroko. The number most often cited in Japanese news reports is 4, sometimes 5. All of them are elderly. The best-known names of the most recent generation, women like Nakamura Take, who lived past the age of 100, and Matsuda Hiroko have died one by one through the last decade. At the time of this recording, there are, as far as anyone can confirm, no young apprentices being trained anywhere in Japan in the traditional way. The Japanese government has considered at various points whether to classify the Itako tradition as an intangible cultural heritage so that it might be formally preserved, recorded, supported. So far, no such designation has been made. The mountain remains, the temple remains, the festival still runs twice a year, and visitors still come. Some years, 2 or 3 Itako are there, some years 1, some years none at all. There is a temptation, at the end of a story like this, to frame the disappearance of the Itako as a simple loss, to feel the quiet closing of something ancient, and to be sad in the particular way the 21st century has learned to be sad about all the small traditions it is outliving. That is not wrong. It is also not all of it. The mountain is still there. The caldera still breathes sulfur. The lake is still pale green and cold, and home to almost nothing but its one strange species of fish that has outlasted everything the mountain has thrown at it. The pinwheels still turn. The stones are still being stacked by hand, one on top of the other, by people who may or may not know the whole story of why. Visitors still arrive at Bodaiji. They still light incense for children they have lost. They still stand for a long time at the edge of Usori Lake and say nothing to anyone, including themselves. Grief, it turns out, does not require a licensed professional. What the Itako offered, at the height of their tradition, was a technology for one of the oldest human needs: the need to say one last thing to someone who is no longer here. The specific form of that technology was shaped by one region's poverty, by one religion's cosmology, and by the particular lives of a particular set of blind women who, through no choice of their own, became carriers of a skill the rest of their society was not trained to provide. When they are gone, that specific form will be gone too. Some of what they offered will go with it and not come back, because not everything that disappears finds a new shape. But the mountain, which is older than the ritual, will stay. The reason people came here in the first place will stay. The wind will keep turning the wheels. For more than 1,000 years, in the far north of Japan, people have walked up to the edge of a pale green lake to listen for something that most of the modern world has decided is not there. That some of them went home believing they had heard it is perhaps less remarkable than the fact that so many of them went at all. That they are still going. That even with fewer voices, and eventually perhaps with no voices at all, the path will still be walked. It is enough sometimes to go to the place, even if there is no one left to speak for the dead. The dead are already there. The living have always known where to find them.